Hi, I'm David Stull. I'm the president of the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, and this is Living the Classical Life.
Mr. Stull, we're so happy to have you here at Living the Classical Life. Thank you for being on.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
You're the president of the San Francisco Conservatory, and before that you were the dean at Oberlin. You studied the tuba?
That's right.
And what eventually drew you to the world of leading an institution?
You know, that's something that when I reflect on it, actually, when students ask that question, I think they perceive it as a path, meaning it's a life goal you set at the age of 18, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. The reality is I began really just simply passionate about playing the instrument. And what happens with many people over time is when you love something and you're sort of transgressing a life path, if you will, and of performance and of teaching, what have you, along the way, you begin to get curious about the art form itself, broader than your participation, broader than your own experience, but sort of the existence of music and art within the context of culture. And I found that for myself, there was a very interesting set of opportunities that began to emerge around changing the way in which music functions within the context of community or the world. Meaning, instead of thinking about these nonprofits as standing there with their hands out, or perhaps classical music really isn't as desired as it once was, recognizing that, in fact, that couldn't be farther from the truth, that there's even a greater need for it now than there was historically. But it meant that the business models had to change for music. It meant that the ways in which we produce music had to change. And it was really clear to me that the experiences that I'd had as a student, while tremendously valuable and even critical to today's students, that there had to be a different approach to preparing musicians to live in that world, to be successful. And the opportunity to work on the development of a curriculum that sponsored that, a chance to work on the development of a school that believed in that, became really seductive. And just like learning a new piece, preparing a new piece, it was an opportunity to chart uncharted territory. And I think for musicians, that's what we love to do most, is have an opportunity for creative work combined with the discipline of execution. And in many ways, I see leading an institution as being that kind of work. So the path was circuitous, to say the least, but it was one that evolved over time based on a belief that not only was I curious about it, but felt I could make a difference in that area of work.
How does one train to be an effective leader of an institution? Is there such a thing? How do you go from being a music student to being the president of a great conservatory?
Lose a bet is usually my answer to that question. I think that the training aspect, because there are master's programs out there that seek to prepare people in arts administration, but my advice often to students is counter to that. I think the first thing you must do is to study music. You have to understand the tremendous commitment it is, what it is to be an expressive artist, and to undertake that path. I really do believe that if you're going to lead an institution, you have to know at its core what it's about. The other aspects, I think, of being an effective president are actually not typically those that you might find in a curriculum around arts management, strangely enough. I think substantial knowledge of literature, mathematics, philosophy, history, political science are actually more interesting areas to draw on from the standpoint of leadership than someone who actually says, this is how you will manage. Because great leadership and management, they're two very different things, fundamentally are about knowing the people you're leading and advocating for them. So for you to know those people, you have to understand what fundamentally makes them tick. And for that to work, you have to find a way to connect with them. So the more that you know about the world, and the more you encounter passionate people within the world, the greater knowledge you have of the world, the greater capacity you have to connect with those individuals, meaning the capacity to change institution, which is about winning trust of those willing to trust you, increases. And that fundamentally is the core of leadership. The aspects of financial management, building a budget, board governance, these sorts of things, which are, yes, critical features, are frankly very easily taught. And even if you learn them along the way, they are, for a person who's mastered other subjects, very easy to acquire. So I think that the first part, knowing yourself, being passionate about the discipline, having a knowledge of the world, these are the things which are the core features of developing, at least educationally, the background to become a leader. I think that the second most important thing, or perhaps it might be the first most important thing, is finding people you really admire to work with. Coming out of school and saying, I'm now prepared to lead isn't the path. I was very, very fortunate to work around inspiring people who inspired me to get involved, who said early on, listen, you should really try this, or why don't we give you a little something to work on and see how you do with this project. And just like working with a great teacher, there's no substitute for that. So those are the experiences, I think, which often lead to people being really effective in these roles. But I don't know that it's something that necessarily emerges from a specific curriculum. It emerges more so from a specific disposition and a desire to serve something. And that's maybe the part that most people miss, is that's really an act of service. It's not so much, there's nothing often very glamorous about it. As much as it may seem so, it's actually not glamorous work.
How do conservatories today train music students to be smart about career issues or self-management? I know that a lot of conservatories don't address this issue. Is that the responsibility of teachers, or is that the responsibility of institutions?
I think it's both. But I think it's important to disaggregate the two in certain respects in this way. A great conservatory experience still fundamentally is about this wonderful apprenticeship model which we enjoy. It's very expensive. It's one that very few institutions today can employ because of how much it does cost. But in a way, I think it is the path of greatest transformation for a student relative to education. And I mean a transformative path to the person, not just their understanding of music, but how they interact with the world. But faculty who are often great teachers, say in a private setting, have become so because of almost a myopic relationship with what they do. That myopia can get in the way occasionally. We're talking about broader issues because they feel that that's a distraction. But it's nonetheless how they've achieved a certain point where they can share that with a student. So the institution's job is, again, it's about that connection factor, understanding where the faculty member is, why they have that disposition, but then also knowing what the student needs. Because inevitably there's this interesting conflict between the fact that the transmission of the canon to a student is inevitably historical. This is a great canon. These are the works of Bach. These are the interpretations of Bach. Now you're going to find your voice for Bach. But you're essentially looking back in time. But for a student, what an institution has to do is look forward in time. Where are you going to be in 50 years, 20 years, 30 years? How does the education today become something that's very valuable to you 60 years from now, not just 2 years from now or 3 years from now? So the institution, I think, has the responsibility to look forward, while inevitably the faculty, in a way, have a responsibility to not look backward, but be aware of the demands of excellence that come from the past. And it's successfully fusing these very two important mission parameters is what leadership is about. So that does have to come from the president. That is institutional. But the institution has to plot that course, provide those beacons of light for faculty to go towards, while very much respecting the core enterprise that defines great teaching.
Do you feel that there's something that's essential in the life of a young student today that is perhaps not offered in a standard curriculum that you would like to see become more standard?
Yes, I mean, I would have to say that one of the reasons that I was inspired about going to San Francisco was they were prepared to deploy an entirely new curriculum. I mean, fundamentally, I think that conservatory education must change, needs to change. And but institutions have a tendency to change if they can see other models that are successful. So the question is, which model is the first one out of the gate? Who's willing to stick their neck out the farthest and take the greatest risk? Because change is about risk. And I think today that we can no longer think about conservatory education as merely being vocational training. We're going to teach you to play the piano, and we're going to teach you to play the great repertoire, the great concerti that comprise the canon for this instrument. That, and even if we began expanding that, it began with soloist, and then we start thinking, oh, well, maybe it's more about collaborative piano plus soloist, or maybe it's about chamber music and accompanying. those are important conversations, but I think there's a bigger conversation to be had, and that is, what are the life opportunities for this student when they leave? And what are not what's required for an artist today, but what's required for a lifetime of success. Suppose the person becomes highly successful as an artist and has a career of 15 or 20 years, but then wants to change completely their life and how they spend their time. Should their degree stop functioning for them at that juncture? Is that a fair trade when they pay us tuition? Should we know what a life path looks like. They don't, because they've come to us at a point in life we're not thinking that far ahead. But I think it's our obligation to do so. So the curriculum has to become one that not only looks at the challenges and the opportunities artists have, but challenges and opportunities for people. And if this is a degree program, we're going to offer a degree, what should it mean to do that? Because I think it means that the person's equipped to be successful actually in any field. And for a long time, these two options, either the success in any field or the success musician, were seen as mutually exclusive. And I actually see them as completely interlinked. I actually think you end up with a far better curriculum. And I actually think there are 4 components to that, which I'm happy to tell you about if you like. And that is that it's about developing a person's artistry, their intellect, their professional skills, but most perhaps importantly, their individual voice. These are the 4 things that matter. And I think that comes down to artistry is about chasing excellence and developing this fantastic technique, but really developing your capacity to tell a story. You know, being someone who's going to connect with an audience and do it at the very highest level. Critical thinking comes from intellectual engagement. I think it's important for every artist to have this. I think it's important for any person who is functioning within the context of a company to have it, or functioning in the world, to be able to step back, analyze an object, and offer perspective. Not just a reaction, but true perspective on events, on opportunities, on challenges. The third piece, the professional development, is really about business skills, and not specifically sort of music entrepreneurship. I think that is far too limiting. How the Metropolitan Opera governs its books, the New York Philharmonic or the San Francisco Symphony, those are interesting things to talk about, but they're essentially irrelevant to a graduating musician, because you're not sitting on a $400 million endowment and $30 million of annual giving, and several $1 million in ticket sales in a concert hall. You have yourself. So I think that those skills are better taught from the standpoint of how does a company launch itself, how does a startup work, rather than how does a standard nonprofit work, because every student who graduates is essentially a startup company. That's what it's like. That's really the experience for them. And if you have those skills intact, it serves you for a lifetime. The fourth thing, individual voice, is letting students come to terms with what's special about them. Because as we all engage the canon of the literature we're playing, for us on the orchestral side, we're learning excerpts, we're developing this sense, can we win an audition? For a pianist, it's can I win a major competition? But sometimes along the way, we lose the fact that this is a creative art form, and the voice matters. The person's voice matters. And they start to learn through this experience, what am I best at? Maybe it is that you want to lead a conservatory someday. Maybe it is that you've decided you want to study music, but then transition careers immediately. Maybe it is teaching is what you'd love to do. Maybe you find as a collaborative pianist you're fantastic. Maybe it's that you can transpose better than anybody else in your class. Well, where do we allow a person to come to terms with that aspect of their own understanding? And then how do we get them comfortable, most importantly, with taking risks? Meaning, we'll say we want you to be an entrepreneur, but you give you no chance at that until you graduate. That's hardly really dealing with the fundamental challenge of entrepreneurship, which is taking that first risk, staying off the precipice, and there's no net. Because schools are great at providing nets and support and resources and voices and teachers, but it's very didactic. It's often sort of unidimensional in the sense that we're giving you this information. But it's rare that the school turns it around and says, okay, now it's time for you to lead your own project, you to experience your own artistic voice. So a great curriculum, in my view, should deal with those 4 components: development of artistry, critical thinking, professional skills vis-a-vis how it is to start up, and then risk-taking individual voice. What is it to take risks? And so that has caused us to completely re-engineer the conservatory model overall, and I think that's a very important piece.
For students who have doubts about whether or not they can make it in the field of music, what do you tell them? Do they have to diversify their musical activities? Are there other questions that they should consider in moving forward?
No, this comes up obviously all the time, especially with parents even more than students, because they're about to make a major investment. And remember that even if you have a full ride to an institution, and someone says, oh my goodness, it won't financially be a burden for this family, I think perhaps the most important thing is that period of life only comes once. You know, ages of 18 to 22 or 22 to 24, 27, because before long, you simply don't have that discretionary time. And what everyone will learn over the course of their lifetime is time is far more valuable than money, by far, especially period of life. So the question, I think, is less of a financial question, it's more of a time question. And then what should you get back? Well, if you don't pursue your passion and stick yourself directly into the center of it and love every minute of it, you will regret it for the rest of your life. Period. The end. And what I mean by that is that so many people who at that threshold of 18 knew they wanted to study music and didn't, find themselves doing it 10 years later because they're compelled to do it. It is so much harder to do it then. That's the first mistake often. So my advice is do it. The second thing I would say is do not see it as a means of disabling your opportunity in another sector of the business world or otherwise. Because musicians are so incredibly well equipped to be successful. And there's a very specific reason for that, actually a set of reasons. One, they're driven. Two, they know what excellence is. Three, they work well in teams. They work well on their own. They get criticism every single week of their life and bounce back from it and turn it into something better. They know what it is to work under pressure. 8 o'clock at night, you must do your best work with the spotlight on everyone in front of you. You know, one of our alums who launched Blue Bottle Coffee, which is wildly successful in San Francisco and here in New York now, I was in an interview and they said, you know, what's hard about running this company? He said, you know, after I played Pierre Lunaire with members of the San Francisco Symphony on stage at Davies, he said, nothing was hard after that. He said, this isn't hard. He said, that's hard. This is not hard. Point being, if you looked at liberal education as a construct or any other choice, communications at a state school, business as a state school, nothing anywhere will challenge you the way a music school will challenge you every week. Every single week. You have to show up in studio class and you have to play. Is there any way to cheat at that? Can you possibly hide the fact that you didn't practice? Can you possibly hide the fact that it's not memorized? Can you hide the fact you're not prepared? You can't. You are fundamentally accountable for every single week your work being better. That sets up a habit of self that is so phenomenally valuable to the rest of a person's life and that simply doesn't happen almost in any other field of education. And yet any Fortune 500 executive you ask, what do you want for your employees? Well, I want them to be focused, engaged, creative, able to work on their own, under pressure, with a real understanding of what it is to reach a goal. But I need to be able to tell them when things are out of line. They have to be able to have the sort of resilience they need to be successful. They have to be professional. They have to know how to present themselves. And goodness, if one of them could just stand up and give a talk in front of a room full of people and explain their ideas without sweating, I would be thrilled. It's very interesting how the characteristics of the modern world and the modern economy are so much drawn from the experience of what happens in music. So what that tells us is that if we just amplify and very carefully curate the experiences around a core musical experience, we can prepare our students for any of those paths of success. But at the same time, they become more interesting artists because if they're going to perform a new work from the stage, they introduce it to the audience. They might write a set of program notes which expose you to the idea of this work or why it's important. They start to think about program curation. They start to become more creative about venue, more creative about who their partners are and why. They start to think about media. They start to think about sound design. And because suddenly no one's limited them as relative to those options are. So the same culture also is conducive to them thinking more successfully about what they might do next and what they're best at. So my short answer is no. If you really know you want to do this, find the right school and chase it. But that's the most important thing, is finding the right school. You know, one that, yes, who's prepared to admit you based on where you are with your skill level, one you can afford, but one where you sense that these things will be tended to in your education. So essentially the right questions to ask are, you know, is this curriculum designed in such a way that I know I am prepared as best as I can be for success in life, not just success in music? So my answer is go for it.
So we've been talking about the cost of music education,
Right.
and to get really specific about that, music conservatories have become so expensive that a lot of my peers and colleagues have graduated with a lot of debt.
Exactly.
Are conservatories on track for offering students something that's sustainable in their view?
You know, this is not just a question for conservatories, it's a major question in American higher education. And I'm going to step back and do a little stump speech for one thing. We, the American people, spent $4 trillion in the Middle East, okay, on a war there. And I think if we look back on that, I think most people would agree that this hasn't led to a more verdant, peaceful world. That same $4 trillion, if you would have taken the 100,000 public schools in the United States of America, K through 12, could have given each one of them actually a $20 million endowment. No, a $40 million endowment. I'm sorry, do the math. It's a $40 million endowment.
That's amazing.
So think about that for a second. What if we then decided, well, no, we think everyone should have access to a debt-free education in this country? Well, with $4 trillion, you could certainly do that. Not a problem. The first thing we're going to have to do is recognize that if the economy of the United States is based around innovation, creativity, hard work, investment, team building, one, schools should see that the curriculum is conducive to that. Two, we shouldn't be belaboring students with debt, because if they're going to start small companies, they can't afford to be paying that money back. Their only choice is to join an existing private sector job, or they can't make the grade, they can't make the debt payment. So if small business is the cornerstone of the American economy, which it is, its innovative side, how does that happen if the people who would start small businesses before they have children and have mortgage payments and everything else have this loan debt? The answer is it can't. So this is a national challenge, and I would actually describe it as a national emergency, frankly. It has to be dealt with. But let's fall back to conservatories for a moment. One of the great mistakes is to say, well, conservatory training is vocational training. So if the orchestras decline, we need fewer conservatories, or if they increase, we need more. Completely false. Conservatories are educational institutions. They should think of themselves this way, and if they don't, shame on them, and start now. The next thing I would say is that for us, I can only speak for San Francisco Conservatory, a fundamental goal is to eliminate debt completely from our students' lives. And the way I've described that to our donor base is, we're very fortunate. We're only about 400 students, and when we're done with the curricular implementation we have, we'll be at about 485 students, 490 students. But essentially, you can eliminate debt. A good way to think about eliminating debt for students is to have your endowment be $1 million per student. So for $1 million per student in the bank, you can in perpetuity eliminate debt for that student. Forever. Every time a student comes into that chair, they go away debt-free. So the question really is for the city of San Francisco is, one, do you want a great conservatory, which they really do? And the second thing is, are there, since we have, round numbers, $100 million in assets, 300 people here in this town who are prepared to, as an estate gift, provide $1 million to in perpetuity guarantee a debt-free educational experience again and again and again for student after student after student? Are there 300 people ready to do that by making a $1 million gift just as part of their legacy and estate plans? And the reality is they're far more than you think, because of how many people want to see that happen for the next generation, because they do want to give that back. So schools have to become more focused on creating the right message for their alumni base and their donor base relative to what the mission should be, which is to provide debt-free education. Students, I believe, should pay something for education. It shouldn't be free. I actually don't believe in the tuition-free model that many conservatories have gone to, and the reason is because there has to be the student and the parents have to know this costs something, because it's extraordinarily valuable if it's done right. But it shouldn't cost more than people have. They have to stretch, but not break. And the students should be able to leave that experience free of debt, having paid for their education while they're in school. And reasonably, again, it's a very interesting formula, but about $1 million per student, you should be able to accomplish that overall for all of your students. So our plan includes that as a fundamental cornerstone aspect of what we want to achieve over the next 7 years for the school. As to students who are carrying debt now, I wish I could go back in time and start this sooner, but I can't. So the reality is, what can we learn from that? Hopefully all of us can learn that for the next generation, if we do want each generation to have a better opportunity than we had, then that's the investment we need to make in it, and that's the way to go.
What character traits does it take for the leader of an artistic institution to be an effective fundraiser?
I think the first thing you have to be is passionate about what you do. You can't fake it. I don't think I would be an effective fundraiser for things I don't believe in. There are people who can do that, but I don't think personally I would be able to do that. I think that when people ask, how's the U.S. coming for $50 million or $20 million, which I actually have done fairly frequently. The quickest way to describe it is to say to someone, even a student in a conservatory, if I said to you that you could cure cancer and that it would cost you $50 in a donation, even as a student, would you try and make that happen? And almost 100% of the students who ask that question of who, are counting pennies to go buy Chinese food and whatever else will say, yes, I would find that, I would make that happen. I'm like, okay, so now all we're talking about is a decimal point, really. Is it $50, $500, $5,000, $50,000, $500,000, $50 million? It's a relative question based on a person's capacity. And you have to remember that many, many, many wealthy people in the world are not out there using their wealth just to buy the next Ferrari or the next house. They have reached a point in their life where they see it as a force for good. They want to somehow transmit that wealth into truly making the world a better place. There are more people like that than you might imagine. And for them, the decimal point just happens to be farther to the right. The question is, can you make a compelling case about what it is that you do, why you believe in it, why it's valuable, why it's important, and why it matters to them? If you can make that case, more often than not, you're going to find that people invest in what you're doing. And they think about it as an investment. Most people with serious resources give philanthropically in the same way that they buy hedge funds. Do they believe it's a good bet? The return is just different. One is emotional and almost spiritual, for lack of a better word.
Yes.
And the other one is financial. But actually, the assessment mode of the two things is very similar for people. Do they trust the person they're talking to? Are they convinced the person they're talking to has the capacity to execute on what they're saying they'll do? So you really have to know your school. You have to know the metrics really well. You have to know the business plan inside and out. You have to really understand how all the business functions work in the school. You have to be able to be quick on your feet. You have to be able to respond to the donors' questions, and you have to be direct, And you can't run the entire conversation from the belief that you're trying to tell them what they want to hear, because they're going to pick up on that right away. But the one thing you do want to do is to listen charismatically to what they're saying, because you want to get to know very, very well what the person you're talking to believes in. You have to find out what they care about, and then creatively connect that passion of theirs to what you are doing. Because if you can do that, and they invest in it and they see the result that they're looking for, I've had so many people who've given major gifts to schools come up and say, thank you so much, this is the greatest thing I've done in my life. When they're the one who made the gift. But it's true. But I think any of us who've written checks or supported things or given our time to things we believe in, the fact is that reward really is greater than anything you can experience. So a lot of it is remember that for many people, though it seems like an enormous amount of money to you or to me, for certain people, it is a large sum of money, but it's something that they can afford to do. And the second thing is that they're just as interested in being inspired and passionate about something and putting their resources towards good as anybody else. And they're actually, I'm pleased to say, if there's great hope for the future, far more people like that in the world than you imagine. And that's what makes fundraising interesting.
And finally, for young music students moving forward, looking at their lives in music unfold, is there something that you would recommend to them that they should do more of while they are students?
Yes, I always look back on my own education. I shake my head. I'm like, if I only would have spent more time in the library or the practice room or done these things. This time only comes once, and there is a balance, though. I would say this. It should be a balance between a great deal of hard work and a great deal of fun. I get very concerned when conservatory students get so wrapped up in the challenge of what they're doing that they're forgetting to enjoy life. And the reason I get concerned about that is if that becomes a habit, it's a very hard habit to break. And life happens now. Music happens now. It also makes it challenging to be a real artist. When you walk onto the stage of the concert hall, there is no future, there is no past. There's this moment in time. That's what's great about music. It's ephemeral. It's going to happen then and there. So you have to find a balance between work and play, between your own ideas and those that people wish to give you. And I would spend time, I would start on Monday for 2 hours or an hour. I'd step back and say, am I really getting out of my education everything I want right now. And try and truly step back and do the best you can to have perspective on your own life is a habit. So you look at it and say, what would I do differently this week that I didn't do last week to have greater success or greater happiness or greater joy? Or why do I continually run into this problem and I don't seem to be solving it? To step back and say, okay, my goal now is just to solve that. So reflection is the answer to that question, combined with constantly setting goals for yourself, but at the same time being gentle with yourself. You have to find that balance to drive yourself and take good care of yourself, be gentle with yourself. And that's a really tough thing to strike in a seriously competitive environment. But the culture of the school is right, where that competition comes from within, not from without, that the students really support each other, though they're driving themselves independently. It's possible far more often for students to develop a better, effective relationship with that balance of life. But that's what my advice would be to them. Take the work seriously, but not yourself too seriously. It's a happier life that way.
Mr. Stull, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been a pleasure to have
Absolutely,
you.
my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
Awesome. It was fun.
Yes.